Good morning, Toronto Star readers and its political podcast listeners and viewers to the Star's website. My name's Althea Raj. I'm a national columnist with the Toronto Star, and I'm super thrilled this morning to be joined by our stellar Ottawa Bureau. Mark Ramsey is a reporter in the Ottawa Bureau. He is with us actually from Toronto. Raisa Patel is an Ottawa Bureau reporter. She joins us from our Ottawa Bureau. And the newest member of the Star team is Ryan Tumulty. Thank you so much, Ryan, for joining us this morning. Also from the Ottawa Bureau, they're in different rooms. This morning, we are here taking your questions. So please, if you do have a question, feel free to drop it in the comment section at the bottom of this screen. And we're going to just jump right in because it has been such an exciting week in Canadian politics, and we're only on day 2. Ryan, let me start with you. I think the question on everybody's mind, after Chrystia Freeland's resignation, how long can Justin Trudeau hang on as Liberal leader?
I mean, there's the technical answer to that question, which is as long as he wants. There's no process in Canadian government to push a prime minister out. And so far, we have not seen that groundswell in caucus that could maybe see him lose the party support, but it is growing. At the start of yesterday, before Minister Freeland made her stunning announcement, there were 2 MPs who publicly said that he should resign. I think we're around 6 or 7 at this point, and it could be more by the time we're done with this call. Certainly, the pressure on him is growing. I think Minister Freeland's statement was decisive. It was a real knife into his political future. And so I think he's going to be facing a real challenge.
Raisa, I kept seeing you on my CPAC feed throughout the day yesterday. You were hanging out in the hallways of power. Can you tell us a little bit about the color and what you heard and how long you think Mr. Trudeau might be the Prime Minister of the country?
Yeah, it was a very interesting day up on the Hill yesterday. There were reporters sort of camped out in the hallways and bags and coats and coffee cups everywhere. And it was one of those days where you start your day on the Hill and you end it there 10 hours later. There was also a late night emergency caucus meeting. So those were very chaotic scenes as well. You know, tons of MPs just streaming into one caucus room, and there was like a big crush of reporters kind of descending on everyone who was entering that room. So definitely a bit of an intense day. I think it's, you know, Ryan kind of hit the nail on the head. This is a decision that's up to the Prime Minister, and whether that, you know, whether he's smart about how he handles that choice, that kind of remains to be seen. There are a number of people, more people than we saw in October, calling for him to step aside. But at the same time, he seems to genuinely believe he's the only person who can take on Pierre Poilievre in the next federal campaign. And the longer he sort of waits to make a call, the shorter the runway is for any kind of successor to gain ground. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over the coming weeks and months.
One of the things that kept coming up in my calls with Liberals yesterday was that this was an own goal. Like, this is a Liberals emerging from a self-inflicted wound. Mark, I said this on TV last night, but like, how stupid a move was it that the Prime Minister told the Finance Minister just days before she was supposed to table a fall economic statement in the House that she was going to be shuffled out of this portfolio? What does it mean about the kind of the judgment around the Prime Minister's office and how well they can actually read their team?
It's shocking, and it was clear yesterday, as Raisa said, the intensity around Parliament Hill. But it was also clear listening to kind of as ministers and MPs kind of filed in and out of those meetings, when they got asked these questions by reporters and they just stumbled upon their words. They didn't really know what to say. Most of them couldn't even give, you know, genuine qualified support. It really seems like the center doesn't really have a good grasp about what's going on in caucus. And even caucus whip Ruby Sahota was asked, you know, is caucus still confident in the Prime Minister? And she could only say, I'm still confident in the Prime Minister. And then she stumbled upon her words, couldn't even say if someone in the meeting had called for him to resign, which we know according to our sources that there were calls for him to resign in the meeting. So it seems like they're not able to control the message anymore.
One of the themes that kept coming up in some of the reader questions was about NDP leader Jagmeet Singh and how long he could possibly lend his support to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, we heard Mr. Singh actually call on the Prime Minister to resign. Raisa, you've been following the NDP for quite a while. How do you think Ms. Freeland's resignation affects the qualified support of the NDP and the length of this Parliament?
Yeah, like I think it's important, obviously, to contextualize that the NDP were in this deal with the Liberals where they formally propped them up. That deal expired prematurely in September. And what's been so fascinating to watch is how the NDP have been navigating this post-deal period. And I think they've really struggled to do that and to kind of figure out their identity during this time. You know, for all intents and purposes, it looks like they're still propping up the government. They have not declared a loss of confidence in Justin Trudeau's government. They, you know, voted with him on the GST bill recently. You know, he hasn't been supportive. Jagmeet Singh hasn't been supportive of absolutely everything, but it was really interesting yesterday to hear him still struggle to say whether he was ready at this point in time when Trudeau has, you know, made this massive blunder that has these massive implications, whether or not he definitively still has confidence in the Trudeau government. If there was any time to sort of declare that definitively, it might have been yesterday. He did call on the Prime Minister to resign. He did say all options are on the table. And then later in the day, the party did sort of put a timeline on that demand, which is that they want to see him resign by the end of next February, at which point they would be ready to declare a loss of confidence in the government. So I guess that's the timeline that we're looking at, but it's interesting that he didn't say that more, you know, outright yesterday.
Ryan, do you think we'll have an election in February?
Yes, is the short answer. You know, I don't want to say it out loud because I've been wrong about this about 5 times now in terms of election timing. But I do think one is coming. I think the NDP would really struggle to explain why they were supporting the government at this point. The only way I think that an election in February can be avoided is if the Prime Minister either decides to call an election in January or decides to resign and start a Liberal leadership race. In that scenario, I could see the NDP waiting for a new leader before they bring down the Parliament.
I heard, Mark, well, I've heard and saw your reaction. Do you want to add to that?
I mean, I just I find it funny when he said, you know, he's been wrong about that like 5 times before, and so have I. I mean, just over the summer when it was looking like there was starting to be a mutiny in caucus over Justin Trudeau's leadership, you know, some people thought there could be a fall election. Then, you know, it's beginning to look more like it could be a spring election. Then Chrystia Freeland resigns. We really don't know. Interestingly enough, I mean, the Conservatives have kept challenging Jagmeet Singh to declare non-confidence in the government, and have even accused him of waiting out for his pension, which starts in, I think, February. He's kind of dismissed that as, you know, I'm going to win my seat regardless. But it is true that for the NDP, it's likely about their political fortunes as well. I mean, they're not doing all that well in the polls either. And they're probably afraid of what could happen if there is an election. And that right now looks like it could be a majority Conservative government. So they're obviously interested in their political fortunes as well.
Raisa, let me just, you're like the House procedure geek in the office. Let me ask you, you know, there's no more confidence measures scheduled before Christmas. What does the confidence schedule look like when we come back when the House resumes at the end of January?
Yeah, I guess we do have the potential for more confidence votes in the new year. We kind of ran out the supply cycle for this session. So there will be future opportunities. There will be the federal budget, for example, which is another test of the government's confidence. And all of that is sort of around springtime, which is when everyone thinks the next election call could be. So those will kind of be dates that we'll be watching.
Okay, let me get into some of the reader questions. Nick, who wrote to me on X, formerly Twitter, wants to know why Jagmeet Singh keeps propping up the Liberals. Specifically, he wants to know whether the return to work for Canada Post workers will lead to a non-confidence vote by the Liberals. Do you think, any one of you who wants to take this, that the Liberals' response to the Canada Post strike will affect the NDP's calculation about whether or not they continue to support the Liberals? It didn't seem to make a difference when it was the CN or CP rail strike, right? Race, you're nodding. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen, particularly when the NDP had their deal with the Liberals, we saw, other job action situations where it, I think, factored into the NDP eventually wanting to leave the deal, but was not, the so-called nail in the coffin. I don't see this recent intervention from the Labor Minister, prompting the NDP to declare non-confidence right away. It hasn't happened yet, first of all. And as we've discussed today, yesterday there was, arguably even bigger political news that would have prompted that kind of reaction from Jagmeet Singh, and he wouldn't even, say anything definitively yesterday. So I don't think this recent move from Minister McKinnon is going to spark that reaction in Jagmeet Singh right away. Could it factor into future decisions to help bring down the government? Potentially, it might be things that they're adding to their file of reasons to trigger an election, but I don't think it'll be a definitive thing for sure.
Ryan, Mark, do you feel the same way?
I think the government waited a long time before intervening in Canada Post. And I think that was purposeful. I don't think that was so much about the NDP's support. I think the government feels like they are losing support from labor groups because they are having to intervene. But I also think they genuinely feel like in the case of the ports and the rail strikes that they had to intervene. Both of those strikes were costing the Canadian economy billions of dollars a day. Canada Post just isn't as essential to the Canadian economy as it once was. So I think the government waited a very long time. I think they came to the conclusion that this wasn't going to be settled if they didn't do something. And I think that's why they stepped in. But I think what you're seeing in the delay there really doesn't have to do with the NDP. It has to do with courting the vote of Labour writ large and not wanting to jump in again into another labor dispute.
It's interesting to.
Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, it's interesting to. The intervention from the Labor Minister didn't completely settle this matter either. This is going to be, I think in May or sometime in the spring, and as
May
Raisa
22nd,
just said,
I believe. Yeah.
Right, and as Raisa just said, the NDP has now said that if Trudeau doesn't resign by the end of February, they'll be ready to do a vote of non-confidence. So, I mean, if the timing is right for them, they'll look for any reason to present as the public reason why they might be doing that, and that could be something like a labor strike or anything like that.
Nick had another question, and it was about all the talk about the NDP leader propping up the Liberals to keep his pension. We hear this in Conservative Party memes. We hear this from Pierre Poilievre in the House of Commons, the Conservative leader, obviously. Raisa, let me ask you, how valid a reason is the NDP's continuing support for the governing Liberals based on his desire to qualify for an MP pension?
So yeah, it's been fascinating to see how, far the Conservatives have run with this claim that, Singh is only sticking around long enough to get his pension, at which point, he won't care if he, triggers an election that he might lose. Because as we know, MPs are entitled to a pretty nice pension if they serve for at least 6 years. And Singh is not going to hit that mark until early, I think it's actually, interestingly enough, February of next year. Singh has, of course, never said that he is doing this for his pension. I don't think any politician would openly admit to that. But it's something that privately, I don't think is a driving force between behind their decision to hold out on triggering an election call. It's probably worth noting that Poilievre's pension is worth a lot more than Singh's, because Poilievre has been an MP for 2 decades compared to Singh, which has only been
20 years this year.
Yeah, exactly.
We started on the Hill at the same time, so that's why I remember.
So 20 years is a lot longer than, just under 6 years. And it's probably also worth noting that if we're looking at a fall election next year, it's the Conservatives who have the highest number of MPs who could lose out on a pension if they don't get reelected. So there are stakes within his own party too. So it's definitely a catchy talking point, and he's right that Singh will become eligible for that pension next year, but it's not a proven claim at this point in time.
One of the other questions that we kept getting was, why does the Conservative leader refuse to get a security clearance? Ryan, maybe I'll ask you. We hear this a lot. It's like a fallback Liberal talking point. Whenever they seem to be squeezed in the House of Commons, they throw this back. But it is true that Mr. Poilievre has refused to get a top secret clearance in order to get fully briefed on the foreign interference stuff involving India, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I can say, publicly he says that he doesn't feel like he'd be free to criticize the government if he took that security clearance. And certainly, once you have the security clearance, once you've read the unclassified report, there are limits on what you can say, because you know much more and you know where you are potentially hitting tripwires. I think there is concern, I've heard at least that there is concern about sitting down for what can be a very thorough interview. It can be a very interview about, private matters, private financial matters and everything. It's very an in-depth interview when you get one of these security clearances. They ask a lot of details about your personal life, your private life. And I think there are some concerns in Conservative circles that he would essentially be handing over a bunch of information about his private life to public servants who may not be his biggest supporters. I don't know how valid either of those suggestions are. I'm not up for a security clearance. That would never happen. But I think he feels that there is no political downside in not getting this clearance right now. Whether or not the Canadian public wants to change that is obviously up to them. But for right now, he doesn't feel like he has paying a penalty for that. I think during an election campaign, that might turn around for him because Jagmeet Singh and Pierre, Mr. Trudeau and Ms. May are all going to be able to say, I've read these documents. I have absolutely no concerns about any of my candidates. I am comfortable supporting all of these people. Pierre Poilievre may not be able to say the same thing. And we know that in the NSI COP report, which identified that there were MPs who are wittingly or unwittingly helping foreign powers.
Parliamentarians, I believe.
Parliamentarians, that's a good point. Some of those parliamentarians we know were Conservatives. They weren't all Liberals.
Yeah, I believe that they suspect that it was one particular senator. And they would suggest that that's probably not somebody in the internal tent. But yeah, no, I hear you. I do, as we were leaving just before the holiday, or as we prepare to leave just before the holiday, CSIS has said that it is ready to do a briefing to Mr. Poilievre, a threat mitigation briefing, where they would share some information, though not all of the information that they would share with him if he did sit down and get a proper security clearance. We're getting a few questions from readers. I'm going to bounce from one topic to another. This is a question from M, who wants to know, who is the Deputy Prime Minister today and who will be the Deputy Prime Minister next week? And Mark? I don't know.
Well, there is no Deputy Prime Minister right now. I mean, it's important to note the Deputy Prime Minister role doesn't come with a ministry, or there's no department or anything. But that was Chrystia Freeland's old role. She was known as Trudeau's right-hand minister, one of his closest allies and most trusted ministers. But we don't have any signal that there will be a deputy prime minister replacement as of now.
Yeah, sometimes it's been given just as like a nice title to have. I remember Sheila Copps, I believe, was deputy prime minister for a brief moment. A question from Reginald. With the utter chaos surrounding this government, can the GG not dissolve parliament, force an election based on the massive loss of confidence in the sitting government? Raisa is half smiling. Okay, Ryan, go ahead.
No, that's not how these things work. We don't really want a GG weighing in and randomly deciding that the prime minister doesn't have confidence of the House. We have a House of Commons for exactly that purpose. So, you know, if there is no confidence in this government, there's a way for Parliament to demonstrate it, and the GG, I mean, theoretically can jump in here, but shouldn't.
Raisa, did you want to add to that?
I was going to say exactly what I was going to say.
We have seen the Governor General weigh in her sphere of influence, like in 2008, when the opposition parties tried to show non-confidence in the government. And at the time, Prime Minister Stephen Harper decided that he was going to try to prorogue in order to save his skin for a little while. And so the Governor General did have a decision to make about whether or not she was going to grant the sitting government the chance to continue on and get their ducks in order, or if she was going to say no and allow the opposition parties to try to defeat the government. And Cajun, who was Governor General at the time, gave Stephen Harper a lifeline. A controversial move, to Ryan's point, by a lot of constitutional experts who didn't really think that that was appropriate. This is a question from Emily, who wants to know whether Katie Telford, this is the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, long time and only Chief of Staff, has any accountability in this mess. Mark, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say I don't know where I read this, but I read somewhere that Katie Telford was on vacation in New York or
She
something
was
like
away
that.
for the weekend with her son in New York City.
Yes, and that may have irked Chrystia Freeland off after, you know, a while of tension between the PMO and Freeland. So, I mean, I don't have those details myself, but I mean, it's interesting that there's a tension there. And we do know from people who have been in this government and MPs who have spoken to the Star that there is a feeling that power is concentrated too much in the center with people like Telford who run the conversation and don't allow access to the prime minister. I think a few months ago when there was kind of starting to be growing discontent in caucus, a lot of people were upset by Telford's lack of availability and the PM's lack of availability. So it's interesting to see how that might play out.
And I'll say that it even, yes, I'll just jump in for a sec. It goes back, you know, longer than just a few months ago. Like I remember, you know, talking to Liberal caucus sources, you know, up to 2 years ago, and also particularly last year around the big cabinet shuffle that happened 2 summers ago. I was hearing from MPs who would tell me things like, you know, I've never spoken to a journalist about this. I've never, you know, felt compelled to talk about this until now. But the problem is Katie Telford, is what a few of them told me. You know, this person who is, you know, stuck so close to Trudeau's side for so long, and is so, you know, integral to his decision making. You know, we need a change in that office. We need some fresh blood. We need new advice. We need new influence, maybe. And a lot of people pointed to her, you know, going back a couple years as the source maybe of some of the issues and tensions that we're seeing play out today.
I wanted to spend more time on this question because Katie Telford is such a huge figure in the Prime Minister's office, in this government, in this town. And to Raisa's point, she has been the brunt of a lot of criticism. In some ways, the Prime Minister has been protected because the MP's anger has been directed at Katie Telford rather than at Justin Trudeau. Ryan, you've been covering the Liberals for a while. What's your read on that relationship and whether Katie Telford is more harm than good?
Yeah, I mean, I think to start with, you have to think about how remarkable her time in that job is. Prime ministers, and this is of all governing stripes, usually burn through chiefs of staff a little faster. I think Stephen Harper had three or maybe four. It's not uncommon for someone to do this job for only 2 or 3 years because it is an exhausting marathon of a job and it burns out human beings. So I have heard all of the same complaints that Raisa has heard about centralization in the PMO, about everything having to go through Katie Telford. Certainly, when this government came to power, there were sort of two power centers in the PMO. There was Jerry Butts and Katie Telford, and they were both important and maybe both equally important. And we haven't had that, we haven't had two senior players in the PMO since. It has really been Katie Telford and then a bunch of people under her who all have important jobs and semi-senior roles as well. But she bears a lot of the decision making in this government. And so much has to go through her. I've heard a lot of complaints about that. Ministers' offices saying, they're in a line to get onto Katie Telford's desk to make decisions, and that slows everything down.
I think another thing that I don't know that everybody outside of Ottawa realizes is the Prime Minister's office carries a great deal of weight when it comes to ministers' offices. Like Katie Telford has personally selected the chief of staffs that go work for cabinet ministers. And so a cabinet minister, may view that the person that the Prime Minister's office has put in their office is not necessarily there to protect them, but there to protect the center. We've seen a lot of, I guess, the hardest moments this year have been the results of decisions that the centre has forced. I think of the Toronto St. Paul's by-election, which wouldn't have happened if Carolyn Bennett had been removed from cabinet and that seat would have been vacant. The same thing with the Montreal by-election in La Salle-et-Marne, where David Lametti, for reasons that he himself seems to be unaware of, was removed from cabinet, and that seat was vacated and the Liberals lost it. Obviously, what just happened over the weekend and resulted in Monday's shocking resignation from Chrystia Freeland. How much responsibility does Katie Telford have over those decisions? And why does nothing seem to stick with her? We've seen other chief of staffs, we've seen in the past kind of fall on their sword. Ryan mentioned Gerald Butts during the Jody Wilson-Raybould affair. Mr. Butts resigned. Why is nothing sticking to Katie Telford? Tell me your theories. Raisa, start with you.
I mean, I guess it would just be speculation for me at this point. But, especially with the loss of Jerry Butts, I think, this is his right-hand person. You sort of want to keep your allies very close in a scenario as we're seeing now, where it seems like people are kind of coming for your neck sometimes. And maybe, we've seen with Justin Trudeau that this is a prime minister, a Liberal leader who, doesn't want to call it quits, doesn't want to maybe read the writing on the wall, isn't reading the room, really is kind of in it, maybe for multiple reasons, but certainly for his own political legacy. And maybe his chief of staff is the same way. And maybe she, they're kind of two peas in a pod in that respect. And she wants to sort of play it out until the bitter end with the prime minister. And that's maybe the path that they've chosen to take.
I'm going to go to Ryan and then we're going to do another reader questions because Ryan visibly laughed.
Sorry, what did I visibly laugh at?
Katie Telford. Why does nothing stick on Katie Telford?
I mean, ultimately, I think part of the reason nothing sticks on Katie Telford is that she has a constituency of one. The only person who can fire her is Justin Trudeau. They are longtime friends. Justin Trudeau is the one who is ultimately responsible here. We put a lot of pressure on political staffers, and absolutely, you can make a very strong argument across several governments that the prime minister's office and unelected staffers have become far too powerful in this town. But they ultimately all answer to the prime minister's office, the prime minister himself. And, if he had a problem with Katie Telford, he could. He wouldn't even have to fire her. Could just encourage her to resign. And so, I do think, she has to bear some responsibility because she has been an important player in this government. But the prime minister bears all the ultimate responsibility. It's his call. It's his call to, fire your finance minister on a Friday, but still expect her to deliver the fall fiscal update on a Monday. Those are ultimately all his decisions.
Okay, we have a question from Nadeem. Why, along the same lanes, why is Justin Trudeau so insistent on staying on as leader of the Liberals when anyone can, this is what they write, when anyone can plainly see that the public wants change? Mark, let me start with you. Why do you think Justin Trudeau wants to stick around?
I think, just some of the reasons Ryan and Raisa have said so far. I think for a lot of people who, like Trudeau, go into politics, have been in politics for a long time, they're thinking about their legacy. I think he's also just genuinely has a deep disdain for Pierre Poilievre, and he knows if you know i- he needs to fight him, and he wants to be the one to fight Pierre Poilievre and stop Pierre Poilievre. But I think it's also worth asking. I mean, if Trudeau resigns, does anyone want that job at this moment? Is that an appealing job to have? Less than a year to an election in which you're most likely going to be reduced to kind of a figment of what the party was before in Parliament. Those are all good questions worth asking, I think.
It sounds like some people want the job, Raisa.
I think so. I think we can kind of definitively say that people want the job. Whether it's, the best time to take on that job is a very separate question. But I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before in terms of the runway that a new person would have to kind of take on Poilievre and build that credibility and build that support across the country ahead of an election. And that runway is getting shorter and shorter the longer that the prime minister kind of mulls over the situation that he's in. And so I think it's kind of, the reasons are things that we've said before. Maybe he wants to hit the 10-year mark. Maybe there's a certain number that he has in mind. He really does feel, it seems like he has a huge amount of responsibility that he personally feels to be the one to face off against Poilievre in this very critical election. So I think those are all valid reasons, but I think that there's also a lot of context around this that he needs to consider, and maybe he needs to be thinking about, the legacy of his party more than his own.
Question from the same person. What could the Liberals have done differently over the last 4 years to prevent such a groundswell of dissatisfaction from being formed against the party? Brian, is this just the 10-year itch, or is there something the Liberals should have been able to do or should have done in order to avoid the situation that they currently find themselves in?
Yeah, I mean, and this sort of touches on the last question as well, but I've heard from Liberals who genuinely believe they've been dealt a bad hand. Coming out of the pandemic, interest rates, if you had told an economist that you could spike interest rates the way the Bank of Canada did and still have inflation problems, I don't think they would have understood it. This wasn't all supposed to go the way it did. Certainly now, when you talk to Liberals, maybe not this week, but maybe about a month ago, when you talk to Liberals, they would tell you that they genuinely believed that as interest rates came down, as Canadians started feeling better about the economy, as inflation stopped being so much of a worry, Canadians would come around to the Liberal cause, that they would see the benefit of what the Liberals were doing in childcare and pharmacare and dental care, big programs that are potentially helping a lot of people. And that also, the longer they looked at Pierre Poilievre, the less they would like him. And there is some polling that suggests that while Pierre Poilievre is much more popular than Justin Trudeau, he is not necessarily beloved by the Canadian electorate right now. So they had a theory of the case that has not played out. I wonder sometimes if they just think they are sort of too deep into the hole to try to turn things around. I think a new Liberal leader would really struggle to make any kind of change when you've only got at most 10 months till an election.
Mark Race, is there anything you think the Liberals could have done differently over the last 4 years to avoid the situation that they're currently in?
I mean, I think Ryan raises a good point. I mean, if people on the left will say they should have been more progressive, people on the right will say they should have been more fiscally responsible. But there are a few things that along the way they clearly screwed up. And you know, hindsight is 2020. But maybe if they had done things differently, things would be a bit different. I mean, what happened this weekend and yesterday could be one example, but we've yet to see how that plays out. There's also kind of the immigration changes. I mean, they did a complete 180 on that. Again, they thought that they were responding to kind of the needs of the moment, but I mean, you talk to even kind of people who are immigrants to Canada, and they might tell you that things did get out of control. You talk to housing, kind of all the promises that they had made, and we've yet to see the results of that. On carbon pricing, I mean, they waited. I think they're just now starting to roll out ads in defense of carbon pricing. Pierre Poilievre has been screaming at the top of his lungs, axe the tax for, what is it, 2 years now? I mean, it's things that they acknowledge over time, but they just, maybe it goes back to kind of how concentrated power is in this government. But it seems like they have been quite slow to react to certain things, even when they have acknowledged that they were wrong about it.
Raisa, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with Mark in that, this Liberal government has a lot of assumptions about things. They assume, things are going to land with Canadians a certain way and Canadians are going to pick up on certain things. And that has not really been the case. Of course, Mark has done some great reporting on, the carbon levy and the rebates and how their communication around that was, a bit dismal at times. The Liberals also, particularly in the last couple of years, have largely been seen as out of touch on the actual realities that Canadians are facing. As Ryan pointed out, they had to face off against a pandemic, and that was not something that many governments prepare for or expect. But the cost of living crisis that kind of spun out of that, affordability, housing issues, they had very reactionary responses to some of those issues. They didn't necessarily have the best ministers on some of those portfolios. In many cases, it was sometimes the NDP saying, hey, we need to do X, Y, Z, early on in the deal that they had, that kind of prompted some measures there. And so I think they were viewed as out of touch, in the clouds a little bit. They were seen as very reactionary. And they also forgot about, they were so focused on the working class, they forgot about, those working hard to join it, the younger people that helped, in part bring them to power in 2015. And we saw that in the budget earlier this year, which was kind of catered to that demographic of Canadians who they sort of seem to forget existed recently. And so I think those are some of the reasons why we've kind of seen them have declining support as of late.
It has been interesting to see the polling, especially with young people and the very rightward turn of a younger generation, which is not typical. We have a question about all the speculation around Mark Carney. This is the former Bank of Canada governor, former governor of the Bank of England. What happened to all the chit chat about Mark Carney joining as the new finance minister? Ryan, what's the latest juicy gossip?
I mean, I'll be honest, I do not have much on this. I did not have much on Mark Carney joining cabinet in the first place. And I am stunned at the idea of how the mechanics of that would work. I don't think we've really talked about that. So let's assume that all the rumors were true and that he was going to come in and replace Chrystia Freeland. When was he going to get a seat in the House of Commons? And what seat in all of this country is safe enough for him to secure? And if he couldn't get a seat in the House of Commons, how was he going to be finance minister? You can appoint him to the Senate, but a finance minister from the Senate can't stand in the House of Commons. So he can't deliver a budget. He can't do any of those things. like the whole idea always seemed unworkable to me, to the point where I question, how it was supposed to work out. And also, if he was supposed to be finance minister, I feel like that should have been announced before they told Chrystia Freeland she wasn't going to have the job.
Yeah, definitely
So
not rock solid.
yeah, so I think, and certainly after yesterday, I can't see him touching that job with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah, one of the things, like the rumor around Ottawa, was that Mark Carney was going to run in Ottawa South, which is David McGuinty's seat. And Mr. McGuinty was very clear yesterday, I think Raisa was standing in that scrum, that he's running again, and he looks forward to having a shot at his seat again. So that was it's interesting. I want to switch. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Brian.
I was going to say, and David McGuinty runs in that seat as David McGuinty. He does not run as your local Liberal member of Parliament. His family, obviously his brother Dalton, the former premier, have very deep roots in that riding, and actually put their names front and foremost, not the Liberal brand, not the Justin Trudeau brand. So, again, I don't know that that's a safe seat for Mark Carney if he wants it.
I'm going to switch gears because we had some questions about Donald Trump. And in the few minutes that we have left, obviously, Mr. Trump is going to dominate the next sitting when we come back in the winter. And just in the past few weeks, he's not even the president yet. And every time he tweets, everyone responds and scrambles and tries to find a policy response and a political response. This question was from Instagram, I believe. What are some options for Canada other than kissing the ring to counteract the potential Trump tariffs? Mark, let me start with you. What options does Canada have?
Well, I find the framing of the question funny, other than kissing the ring. But we saw in the fall economic statement yesterday, there was an over $1 billion border security plan that they're put out. And as I understand it, we might get more information on kind of some of the things that they're going to be doing there. We also have heard that, Canada will be looking at counter tariffs to the Trump tariffs. We have things here like critical minerals, oil. Doug Ford, has said that he would cut off electricity to American states. So there are these options right there that have been floated out there. Now, whether that's enough to make Trump stand down, we've yet to see. He certainly hasn't shown any sign of that. We could be heading for a trade war for all we know with our closest ally. We've yet to kind of see how that plays out.
Right, so we've seen the premiers kind of scramble in their own directions. Some of them seem completely surprised to see that the federal government was contemplating putting retaliatory tariffs on uranium, on oil, on potash. There's been a lot of visible anger and disappointment from some provincial leaders about the federal government's response so far to dealing with Donald Trump. What are your thoughts on what it means, not just for Canada-US relations, but for the Federation as a whole?
Yeah, we seem to be a very divided country at the moment, and we're trying to project this, United Canada approach. This is a time where I think, the country's premiers and the prime minister need to be a unified face against an oncoming threat that could be catastrophic for the country. And there's been some interesting, differences of opinion there. One of the things that kind of comes to mind for me is, the comments that the prime minister made at the Equal Voice gala recently in Ottawa. And so, this is a gala for a foundation, for an organization that works to get more women and gender diverse people elected in politics. And so the prime minister was recently there giving a speech. And he said that women's progress around the world and in the United States is under attack. And I'll do a side note here and say that's a very ironic thing to say, days before you demote Canada's first female finance minister. But anyway, And then he kind of follows up that comment by saying, the US just voted for the second time not to elect a woman. And that got pushback from, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, amid this massive tariff threat from the Trump administration. Do you really want to be dumping on the US government for electing Donald Trump instead of Kamala Harris? Ford said that those comments weren't helpful at all. It prompted, Elon Musk, who is, joined at the hip with Trump these days, to call Trudeau an insufferable tool, which is quite the insult. So I don't think, as Ford said, I think maybe that was not a super helpful thing to do in this moment, and maybe didn't endear all the premiers to Trudeau and his handling of this issue as well.
Yeah, apparently Ford wasn't the only one who had some choice words for the Prime Minister about those comments. Ryan, I'm going to end our panel with you and your thoughts. Do you think that there's anything the Canadian government can do proactively, or are we just entering this cycle where Donald Trump will say jump and we will say how high?
I mean, certainly there's things that the government and previous governments have done proactively, which is build big relationships in the United States. Canada and Canadian diplomats don't just talk to the president. They talk to governors and senators. They talk to city councilors right across the country and mayors, and all trying to make a deeper, relationship. I think one of the things that maybe gets overlooked is that Donald Trump's tariffs on Canada are going to hurt Americans significantly. And Donald Trump's history in US politics he's not someone who puts a policy in place, lets it be politically unpopular for a long time if he believes in the long term it's going to benefit things. That is not the kind of politician he has been. And so if he puts 25% tariffs on everything coming from Canada, which would include Canadian oil and gas, and pump prices jump by $1 or $2 a gallon, how long is he going to hold out on that? How long is he prepared to have these tariffs drive up prices and anger consumers if the end result is he and his party are less popular? There's an economic theory that does say that if you put tariffs in place, you will eventually bring manufacturing jobs back to your country. But that process takes years, if not decades. And he has 4 years in office. So, it may be the easiest thing for Canada to do is let Donald Trump do what he wants to do and live with the consequences.
That's a dark image for us in this country too. Thank you so much, Ryan, Mark, Raisa, for sharing your insights. I really appreciate your time. Thank you to the listeners, the viewers, the readers who joined us on this call today. Please continue to send us your questions. I'm sure we will resume in the new year. We'll do more of these. Until then, happy holidays. Thank you for tuning in.